Good evening and welcome to Mining the Riches of the Parsha. Tonight is Thursday night, March 16th, 2023. I have a suggestion for this coming Shabbos morning. The Torah reading this Shabbos is very long. It's a double portion, VaYakhel Pekudei. Besides, there's an additional special reading for Parshat HaChodesh. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But this double portion is one of the longest Torah portions of the entire year. It is 214 psukim, 214 verses. Wow. And here's the thing. Almost every single verse of those 214 is repetitious. We already know it. We had the Torah portion a few weeks ago of Truma, and then next we had the Torah portion of Tetzaveh. Within those two Torah portions, the Torah describes the Mishkan, the sanctuary that the Jewish people built to travel along with them as they traveled through the desert. The structure itself and all the utensils, the Aron, the Ark, the Menorah, the Shulchan, the table, the Mizbeach, the altar, all of the different utensils, we know it. All the materials, the dimensions, we know every detail. Our Parsha, VaYakhel Pekudei, repeats every single detail at least twice. Because in our Parsha, we have the Jewish people building it and putting it together and installing it, setting it up. So, every object is repeated over and over. Every material is repeated over and over. Every measurement, every detail is repeated over and over. But we know it already. So here's my suggestion for this Shabbos. To condense the entire Torah portion from 214 psukim down to two psukim. And the Torah portion goes like this. K'chol asher tziva Hashem es Moshe. According to everything that God commanded Moshe, Kain asu b'nei Yisrael es kol ha'avodah. The Jewish people did the work exactly as God commanded. Vayar Moshe es kol hamlacha. And Moshe saw all of the work that was done. V'hine asu osa. Kasher tziva Hashem, Kain asu. Moshe saw that the Jewish people did every single detail exactly as God had commanded. Every measurement, every material, everything was done correctly. Vayevarech osa Moshe. And Moshe blessed the Jewish people for having done such a wonderful job. That's the whole Parsha. That's the whole point of the Parsha. Why do we need the other 212 verses? Okay. Let's start with a more serious question. Why did God command building a Mishkan? And tied to that question is a parallel question. When did God command building the Mishkan? So the Ramban, Nachmanides, says that God commanded the Jewish people build the Mishkan immediately after Sinai. Immediately after God revealed himself at Mount Sinai to the entire Jewish people and spoke the Aseret Dibros, the Ten Commandments. And so God wanted that was one moment, one transcendent, amazing moment of revelation. God wanted that it should be continued. It should be elongated. And so therefore take that moment and concretize it. Institutionalize it going forward. Build a Mishkan that will be an ongoing connection between God and the Jewish people. An ongoing revelation of God's presence to the Jewish people. Immediately after revelation at Sinai, God commanded, build the Mishkan. Let's make it permanent. That's the Ramban. Rashi disagrees. Rashi says the commandment to build the Mishkan was a little bit later, after the sin of the Egel, after the Jews built the golden calf. After the Jews sinned, the terrible sin of building the golden calf, God commanded, build a Mishkan, offer offerings as a way of atoning for the sin that you committed of the golden calf. So, two different opinions about when God commanded building the Mishkan, which each one has a different reason why God commanded building the Mishkan. Okay, fine. But there's a major problem that underlies really everything that we've been talking about over the last 4 or 5 weeks. And that is the order of all of these Torah portions in this section of the Torah. The order of each one of the Torah portions. According to the Ramban, it works out perfectly. Makes perfect sense. First, we have the portion of Yisro, you remember it several weeks ago, which has the text of the Ten Commandments, and Mishpatim that follows, which has the Jewish people saying, Naseh v'nishma, we accept and we will observe. We discussed earlier why it is that the narrative of the revelation at Sinai is in 2 separate Torah portions, because they're 2 separate points of view, 2 separate layers to what is being revealed. Okay, but that's the revelation. Immediately after the Parsha Mishpatim, we have Truma and Tetzaveh. God commands, okay, we had the moment, let's elongate it, let's institutionalize it, build the Mishkan, and here's how you do it. Build this and build that with this material, this size and that size. Okay, fine. Then comes the Parsha of Ki Sisa, and the Jewish people build the golden calf. That's a terrible interruption, because maybe after the sin of the golden calf, God does not want them to build the Mishkan anymore. Maybe God will change his mind. And so then we have the portions of VaYakhel Pekudei, which tell us that in spite of the fact that we sinned with the golden calf, God forgave the Jewish people for that sin, and the project continues. And so in our Torah portion of VaYakhel Pekudei, we have the Jewish people actually building and installing and setting up the Mishkan, so that the interruption of last week's Torah portion of Ki Sisa, the golden calf, it's okay. We go beyond that. Everything flows in order. It's all in chronological order, and it makes perfect sense, according to the Ramban. According to Rashi, it's very hard to understand. Because, remember, according to Rashi, God commanded building the Mishkan only after the sin of the golden calf. So the order of our Torah portions is out of order. We should have had Yisro Mishpatim, that's Revelation Sinai. Then we should have had Ki Sisa, which is the golden calf. And then, after the sin of the golden calf, we should have Truma and Tetzaveh and VaYakhel and Pekudei, all in one straight line. Because God commanded, according to Rashi, God commanded building the Mishkan only after the golden calf. The order that we have, Truma, Tetzaveh, then Ki Sisa, and now VaYakhel Pekudei, it's out of chronological order. So Rashi himself asks this question, and Rashi gives the following answer. Ein mukdam uma'uchar b'Torah. The Torah does not always follow chronological order in the way it tells stories. Sometimes narratives are out of chronological order, but rather in a thematic order. Well, okay, fine, all right, but what is the thematic order? Rashi doesn't explain this part. What's the theme that you're developing by having Truma and Tetzaveh before, out of chronological order, before Ki Sisa? What are we supposed to learn from that? There are a number of suggestions to try to explain Rashi. I actually just learned a new understanding, which I hope to share at a dath tomorrow night on Shabbos Friday night. Okay. But I want to focus now back on the Ramban. Because according to the Ramban, that God commanded building the Mishkan immediately after the revelation in Sinai as a way of elongating that moment and institutionalizing that moment. There is a very, very important lesson for us to learn and a deep reason why we need all 214 verses in this week's Torah portion. The purpose of building the Mishkan, as I mentioned a moment ago, according to the Ramban, is to take the moment of Sinai and to continue it, institutionalize it. Institutionalize that moment of closeness and connection, intimacy between God and the Jewish people, greater than has ever existed before, and have it not be a moment, but have it continue. And so, immediately after the Jewish people say Nasa v'nishma, we commit ourselves to serving God to the best of our ability for the rest of our lives, is the commandment to build the Mishkan, the Parsha of Truma, and Tetzaveh. And then comes last week's Torah portion, Kisisa, and the Jewish people build the golden calf. Once the Jewish people build the golden calf, maybe we're not worthy to have that closeness with God anymore. And even if we are forgiven, remember we discussed this before, Moshe goes up to the top of Mount Sinai and prays to God for forgiveness, and ultimately God does forgive the Jewish people. Even if God forgives us for the sin of the Jewish people, we atone for the sin of the Jewish people, but maybe the intimacy that God had originally planned is now impossible. You know, just to speak in human terms for a moment, if someone hurts you badly, even if they apologize, and even if you accept their apology and you forgive them, you may not want to be around them all the time. You may not want to be in close proximity to someone who has done something terrible to you, even if you've decided to move on, even if you've forgiven them. Our Torah portion, VaYakhel Pekudei, is the confirmation that not only did God forgive us for the sin of the golden calf, but God still wants to be close with us. God still wants us to build this Mishkan where we will meet God, where we will continue this intimacy. And therefore, every single pasuk in this week's Torah portion, VaYakhel Pekudei, every repetition, every detail, every measurement, every material is a nechama. It is a consolation to us. It is comforting us. It is reassuring us that even after the golden calf, God says, I still want you to build the Mishkan. I still want you to make an ark. I still want you to make a menorah. I still want you to make an altar, a mizbeach. Every single verse is confirmation that God wants this relationship with us. Every single verse in this week's Torah portion, all of them, every one is an expression of God's unconditional love for us, in spite of our shortcomings, in spite of the terrible mistake we made with the golden calf. The book of Shemos, and let's remember for a moment, the Torah is divided into 5 books. And it's divided into 5 books because each book is a unit unto itself, with a theme and a beginning and an ending. The book of Shemos, the book of Exodus, the second book of the Torah, begins, we are avadim. We're servants. Servants are valued for their utility. If the servant listens to the master, the servant is good. If the servant does not listen to the master, then the servant is useless. We begin the book of Shemos as servants to Paro. Then we become servants of God. Now, obviously, to be a servant of God is very, very different than to be a servant of Paro. To be a servant of God, there's no persecution, God forbid. There's no terrible humiliation and punishing. None of that exists. But in this one detail, there is a commonality. The relationship that we initially have with God when we leave Egypt is based on a covenant. An agreement. A covenant means an agreement. And the agreement is, God says, you do what I say, and I'll take care of you. That's the agreement. And we break the agreement. We break the contract. We are disloyal as servants to God when we build the Egel Hazav, the golden calf. We broke the agreement. We broke the covenant. But that's not the end of the book, because the book of Shemos ends with our Torah portion, VaYakhel Pekudei, the aftermath of the golden calf. It ends with a new relationship between God and the Jewish people. A new covenant between God and the Jewish people. A more healthy relationship between God and the Jewish people that's based on real love, real mutual commitment. God's love for us now, by the time we get to the end of this book, is not based on what we do. It's based on who we are. It's unconditional. And so, this book begins with a relationship where whoever it is that's our master, we're valued for what we do, and it ends in a very different place with a relationship based on who we are. And that's unconditional. Many people make the mistake of thinking that a good marriage, what is a good marriage? Who has a good marriage? A good marriage is where the husband and wife get along and they don't argue. What's a good family? A good family. What does it mean to have a good family? A good family is when the parents and the children agree with each other. They don't argue with each other. They don't fight with each other. A good shul. What's a good shul? A good shul is where the members of the rabbi don't disagree with each other. They agree. They don't argue with each other. That's a terrible mistake. That is absolutely false. A good marriage is a marriage where there is arguing. There are disagreements. But the arguing is done with respect. And in spite of the differences of opinion, even about deeply held important issues, there is unconditional love. That's what makes a good marriage. That's what makes a good family. That's what makes a good shul. Not that everybody agrees and gets along all the time. That's not normal. But there's respect. And there's an appreciation and love for the other that is unconditional and not dependent on agreeing or disagreeing. And so as we are following the many, many verses in this week's Torah portion, this Shabbos morning, and we are wondering to ourselves as we are sitting or standing and listening and over again, Yes, there's gold and there's silver and there's copper. Yes, it's this size and that size and that size. And we're wondering ourselves, why are we repeating this list again? And why are we repeating it again? We know this already. Why are we repeating it again? Let's keep this in mind. That the book of Shemos, and this is the ending, this is the climax of the book of Exodus, is the story of the development of the relationship between God and the Jewish people that starts in one place with one kind of covenant, one kind of agreement, but it ends up in a very different place with a very different kind of relationship. A strong, committed relationship based on unconditional love. And this then becomes the model of the relationships we need to build in our lives. And every repetitious verse in this week's Torah portion reaffirms this truth. Okay. Eile Pekudei HaMishkan. This is the accounting of every material that went into the building of the Mishkan. Kol hazahav ha'asui lemlacha, how much gold was used in all of the different building of the Mishkan, the utensils and the walls and all the different places there was gold. Well, I'll tell you exactly how much there was. Teisha ve'esrim kikar, 29 kikar. Kikar is like a block of gold, 29 blocks of gold, plus shvameos ushloshim shekel, 730 shekels. That's an amount of weight. We use that word to refer to a coin, but it's an amount of weight. So that's how much gold, 29 kikars and 730 shekels. That's how much gold there was. How much silver? Oh, glad you asked. How much silver? The Kesef Pekudei Hoeda, Ma'as Kikar, 100 kikar, 100 blocks of silver, the Elef Ushva Meos V'chamisha V'shivim shekel, and 1,775 shekel. And for each material, the copper, this thread, that thread, the cloths, everything, the exact measurement is given. And here's what's really interesting. We have the accounting in our Torah portion of the exact amount of every single material, and the amount that was gathered was exactly the amount that was needed. You can work it out. Rashi actually does this. You can work it out to see how exactly that amount, to the shekel, that amount of gold, that amount of silver, that's the amount that was collected, exactly the amount needed to build the Mishkan. The Siforno, one of the classic commentators to the Torah, asks the following question. Our Parsha gives us the exact amount of every material, no more and no less. The exact amount. But that is not the case when it comes to the Beis HaMikdash, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. Remember, this was built to be modular, taken apart, put together, carried with the Jewish people through the desert. When they got into Israel, this Mishkan remained the place of worship for about 400 years, until finally Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, built the Beis HaMikdash, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, and now it's a permanent building. It's not this traveling Mishkan sanctuary anymore. Now finally there's a Beis HaMikdash, Holy Temple in Jerusalem. It's permanent. You don't have to carry it anymore. It's permanent. But when describing the Beis HaMikdash that Shlomo built, the prophet says that they collected a lot more of each material than was actually needed to build it. Why did they collect so much more than they actually needed? Well, the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, explains, because they needed duplicates. They needed extra. They needed inventory. You understand, there are lots and lots of utensils. I mean, of course, there's a menorah, there's an aron, there's an ark, fine, an altar, yes. But there were also pots and pans, there were forks, there were spoons, there are all kinds of utensils. And utensils wear out. They break. You have to have an inventory. You have to have backup so that if something happens to one, you can replace it. Every serious business has an inventory, has a supply of the things that they need. Here at Adath, we have extra sidurim. We keep them, and if we run short, they wear out. The prayer books, they wear out over time. They wear out. When they wear out, we retire them from usage. We have some new ones we put into place. We have extra plates. We don't have exactly the number of plates for the number of people that walk in the door. We have extra because they break. They get ruined sometimes. So we have an inventory. Any serious business, any serious operation has an inventory. So when Shlomo HaMelech built the Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim, he didn't collect exactly the amount that was needed. He collected extra, so there would be inventory. The doubles and triples. Keep in storage. When you need it, you take it out. All right, fine. But the question is obvious. If you need the inventory for the Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim, why don't you need inventory for the Mishkan? Why did they collect only exactly the amount necessary to build each item? You mean there was no backup? You mean if something breaks, then what do? You don't have a replacement? You don't have an inventory? Why would there be no inventory for the Mishkan? So I want to share with you an answer that is given by a commentator known as Das Zakanim. I mentioned this briefly a couple of weeks ago. And the Das Zakanim says this concerning the Aron, the ark. Remember, the Aron was a box. Inside the Aron was placed the luchos, the 2 tablets of stone on which were engraved the Aseret Dibros, the 10 Commandments. And so there's this box, the ark, the Aron, to hold the 2 tablets of stone. And the Torah tells us very clearly in the Parshat Truma, and it's repeated in our Torah portion, that the box was made out of wood. It was made out of wood, and it was gold-plated. It was lined on the inside with gold, and it was lined on the outside with gold. So it was 3 layers. It was wood, but it was gold-plated. Das Zakanim asked the question, gold-plated? Why not just build it out of solid gold? I mean, come on. This is the main thing. This is the big object. This is what we're all looking forward to. You can't splurge on solid gold for the Aron, for the ark that holds the luchos. It's the most important object. The Das Zakanim says an amazing answer. The Das Zakanim says, you understand that every single piece that was made for the Mishkan, it had to be taken apart and it had to be carried on people's shoulders to go from place to place over the course of 40 years in the desert. They had to carry it. Nebuch, if it was solid gold, it would be very hard, it would be very heavy. And it would be very hard for people to be able to carry it. So to make it lighter, it was made out of wood with gold plated. And the same thing applied to many of the other utensils. The Mizbeach was not solid copper. It was wood with a copper plating, etc., etc., to make it lighter, to make it easier to carry. And listen, please, to this insight from Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, because here we have a very important principle that applies in every area of Jewish life. Don't be a tzaddik on someone else's back. You want the pure gold. You want to be extra respectful and show honor to this great object. You want it to be pure gold, fine. You carry it. You want it to be pure gold and somebody else has got to carry it? No. Don't be a tzaddik on somebody else's back. Don't be so scrupulous, more than is actually required when someone else is going to have to suffer because of it. You want to take on a stringency on yourself? That's fine. That's fine. That's great. That's beautiful. But don't take on a stringency that somebody else has to deal with, has to have the burden of fulfilling. Rabbi Yisroel Salanter, who lived in the mid-1800s, was known not only for his great scholarship, but also, especially for his sensitivity to the needs of others and the feelings of others. He once visited someone's house on Shabbos, and it came time to wash Netilas Yadayim, to wash our hands, and to make a bracha before we say Hamotzi, the blessing over the bread. Rabbi Yisroel Salanter went over to the basin to wash his hands, and he only washed his fingers, just his fingers, which is not really the best way to do it. Really, we're supposed to wash our hands with water up to our wrist, but Rabbi Yisroel Salanter washed only his fingertips. Someone said to him later, I just want to understand, why did you do it in such a lenient manner, in such a way that is not really the ideal way to do it? I expect you, Rabbi Yisroel Salanter, famous rabbi, you would do it the ideal way. Rabbi Yisroel Salanter answered and said, this was at a time before there was running water. Rabbi Yisroel answered and said, somebody had to walk down the hill and draw the water from the well and carry that pail back up the hill so that we would have water to wash our hands. You understand that? It didn't just appear. Someone had to go down there and fetch it and carry it. I don't want to be a tzaddik and insist on washing my hand all the way up to the wrist when it means that somebody else is going to have to carry more water up the hill. I'll rely on the most lenient opinion and just wash my fingertips. I just need a little bit because I don't want to cause more burden, more work for somebody else. Okay? So that's where there were no duplicates in the Mishkan, because it had to be carried. In the Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim, it was permanent. They weren't going anywhere. So you have inventory. Doubles and triples, you have inventory. But when you got to carry everything, you want it as light as possible. There were no duplicates in the Mishkan. And that's a lesson that every one of us should learn, that whatever way we want to be pious, to go beyond the actual minimal obligation that Jewish law places on us, very nice. Very, very nice. But don't do it in a way that causes somebody else to have a burden. However, there was one object, a very important object, for which there was a double, and from which we learn a crucial lesson. Last week's Torah portion, the Parshat of Kisisa, is the narrative of the Arizal, the golden calf. Moshe comes down from Mount Sinai. He's carrying the luchos, the 2 tablets of stone on which are engraved the Aseret Dibros, the 10 Commandments. He sees the Jewish people have built this golden calf, and he smashes the stones. Then Moshe prays for forgiveness from God for the Jewish people's sin of building the golden calf. And ultimately, God accepts Moshe's prayers and says, Moshe, okay, I'm going to forgive the Jewish people. Come back up to the top of Mount Sinai, and you'll make a second set of luchos, a second set of tablets on which will be engraved the Aseret Dibros. Moshe goes back up another 40 days, and Moshe finally comes back down with a second set of luchos. That day that Moshe returns is the 10th day of Tishrei. That's Yom Kippur. That's the day that the Jewish people saw that God had forgiven them for the sin of the golden calf, because Moshe arrives with his second set of luchos, the second set of tablets. And when the Mishkan was built, the focal point of the Mishkan was the Aron, the ark. Everything was oriented to that. That was the goal of the whole enterprise, the Aron, the ark. It was the most important, because Why was the ark so important? Because inside the Aron were the luchos, the second set of luchos that God had told Moshe to engrave and bring back down to the Jewish people. And they were placed inside this ark. That's why the ark was so important. I mean, it's not the box, it's not the ark that's important, it's what's inside the box that's important. The luchos. And remember the idea that we just discussed a few minutes ago from the Ramban, that the whole purpose of the Mishkan was to take the moment of the revelation at Sinai. So at Sinai, God spoke the Ten Commandments, but now God wants that to be elongated and concretized and institutionalized. So instead of just relying on that moment of speaking the Ten Commandments, God has Moshe write them down. Engraved on these two stones, we have the second luchos, Aseres Adibros. So this is the way in which this moment of contact and intimacy is elongated and continued, with the luchos being the focal point of this Mishkan. Now, the words that were engraved on the second set were identical to the words on the first set. They were identical. Same words, same letters, no difference. And that is what created this institution of the ongoing revelation and contact between God and the Jewish people for as long as the Mishkan was there, and then later the Beis HaMikdash. As I said, the second set of luchos were identical to the first set that had been broken by Moshe. The Torah says this clearly. Ve'echtov al haluchos. God said to Moshe, you will write on the second set of tablets of stone, es hadvarim asher hayu al haluchos harishonim asher shibarta. You're going to write on the second set of tablets, engrave on the second set of stones, exactly the same words that had been written on the first set of stones. They're identical. Let me ask you a question. What happened to the first set? What happened to the broken pieces? Moshe came down the first time, saw the Jewish people had built the golden calf, and he smashes the stones. What happened to the pieces? Let me read this verse one more time, because I didn't complete it. God says to Moshe, Ve'achtov al haluchos, you're going to engrave on the second set of tablets of stones, as hadvarim asher hayu al haluchos harishonim asher dibarta, the words that had been engraved on the first set of stones, v'samtam ba'aron, and place them inside the ark, inside the aron. What do those words mean? V'samtam ba'aron, and place them in the ark, in the box, in the Mishkan. Which ones were placed in the aron? Well, the simple understanding, of course, is we're talking about the second set, right? The first set got broken. There's a first set. They were broken. God says, make another set that's identical to the first set, v'samtam ba'aron, and place them in the ark. Of course, you're going to place the second set, because that's the set that's permanent. That's the set that's going to remain with us. That's placed in the aron. That's the focal point of the Mishkan. That's clearly the simple understanding of this verse. But the Talmud says something different. The Talmud says, Melamed. You know what we learn from this verse? Sheluchos v'shivrei luchos munachim ba'aron. Both sets were placed into the ark. V'samtam ba'aron, according to the Talmud, does not refer to the second whole set. It also refers to the first broken set. So inside this box, there were actually 4 stones, 4 tablets. 2 were whole, but beneath them, 2 of them were placed, but in pieces. And the Talmud derives from this a global lesson that applies to every single one of us in every area of life, melamed. And this comes to teach you Shetalmud Chacham sheshachak tu'almudo. You have, for example, a person who is a scholar, but then they get old, and they become a little bit feeble, and they forget some of what they knew before. They're not the same as when they were younger. Ein noagim bo minhag bizayon. You're not allowed to look down on such a person. You're not allowed to mistreat such a person. You're not allowed to look at this person as if they're ignorant, they're incapable, they're useless. God forbid. Luchos v'shivrei luchos munachen ba'aron. Even though they're broken, even though they do not have the same usefulness, they don't have the same ability as they had before, they are still shown respect. They are still honored. They're still treated with reverence. Ein noagim bo minhag bizayon. God forbid we would never treat a person who is no longer strong and vital and capable. We would, God forbid, never treat that person with disrespect. How we treat those who are elderly, how we treat those objects that are old, how we treat a person who is past their time of usefulness, it is a critical philosophical issue. It is, in fact, how we treat our elderly is a referendum on us, individually and collectively. We don't discard a person just because they're no longer able to do the things that they were able to do before. And the same thing goes with objects. An object that had been used for holiness, even if it gets ruined, even if it no longer can be used for that purpose, we still treat it with respect. An object that was used for holiness, a lulav, an esrog, it was used for a mitzvah, and now it's brown, it's dried up, there's nothing you can do with it. We don't throw it away in the garbage. We have to treat it with respect. A Torah scroll, our holiest object, when it gets old and worn out and you can't read the letters anymore and they're broken and you can't use it to fulfill the obligation of reading from the Torah in shul on Shabbos, for example, we don't get rid of it. We treat it with respect. And if we are going to discard it, we do so in a respectful manner. We bury it. Just like we bury a person who, God forbid, passes away. That's how we show honor. That's how we show respect. The Talmud says in another place, HaTorah mishamraso mikol ra minauroso. Torah guards us in our youth. V'nosnos lo achris v'tikva b'tiknuso. And it gives us a future and a hope even when we are older. Because when someone or something comes into contact with God, comes into contact with holiness, and it becomes holy, that achievement is eternal. It's not dependent on the usefulness. The holiness remains. How we treat objects, even more importantly, how we treat people, is a vital, vital lesson. Luchos v'shivrei luchos munachim ba'aron. Those broken pieces, they're put in the holiest place that there is. The focal point, together with the second set. The most venerated spot in the entire world for its holiness. And there's another aspect to this, because it also applies to our own brokenness. If we look in the Torah, we see lots of brokenness. We see lots of failure. Failure of individuals who make mistakes. Failure of Moshe to be able to achieve his life's goal of entering the land of Israel. And in every one of our lives, failure is inevitable. It's inevitable in our desire to live as Jews according to Jewish law, and we make mistakes. We don't always live up to what we're supposed to do. They're failures. If we're honest, we will recognize that they're failures in our relationships. We make mistakes. They're failures. In our role as spouses, parents, children, in our professional lives, in our jobs, we fail. We make mistakes. We mess up. What this teaches us is that it is possible, and therefore, if it's possible, it is obligatory, to take our broken pieces and learn from them. And the truth is, we need to teach this to our children. And many of us do teach this to our children. Here's one of the ways in which many of us teach this lesson to our children. The Eensy Weensy Spider went up the water spout. Down came the rain and washed the spider out. Out came the sun and dried up all the rain, and the Eensy Weensy Spider went up the spout again. Rabbi Perry Nettler points out that we sing this song to our children and our grandchildren because this song is about our children and our grandchildren, and it's about us. We sing this song because every single one of us is an Eensy Weensy creature. And just like that spider, we fall down. And then we have the ability to get up and to start climbing up again. We have the ability, like that spider, and we want to make sure our children understand this lesson, we have the ability to survive a disaster, to survive a mistake, to survive a failure, and to grow from that failure and to build ourselves up again. We have the ability to climb back up that water spout and to stand up after a fall and to overcome a tragedy. And that is precisely what we did with the luchos. We caused them to be broken, the first set. We caused them to be broken because of our sin of building the golden calf. And then we worked to repair our relationship with God in order to merit the second set. And we cherish both sets. We cherish the second set of luchos because they are whole. And they attest to God's unconditional love for us. And we cherish the first set, the broken pieces, which led us to the second set and remind us of our ability to make amends and to start over and to make better choices as we go forward. In the words of Rav Nachman of Bratslav, if you believe that you can destroy, believe also that you can repair. Luchos v'shivrei luchos munachin ba'aron. The only object in the Mishkan for which we have an extra set is to remind us to value that which is broken, because it leads us to becoming whole again. I want to share with you one more piece. I see that it is a little bit late, so I apologize. And this last piece is somewhat related to what I just discussed with you, but in a very, very different context. The Ramban, Nachmanides, we quoted him before in one context. This is a different passage. In his introduction to this book, the book of Shmos, the second book of the Torah, which we will complete this Shabbos morning with the last double portion, VaYakhel Pekudei. The Ramban says that this entire book, if you look at the book as a whole, is the model of Jewish history. And that model, that paradigm, that pattern, is the pattern that goes from exile to redemption, slavery to freedom. We see this in the structure and in the content of this book of the Torah. For example, the first parsha, the first portion in this book, the portion of Shemos, we read this now, what is it, a couple of months ago. Remember, God came to Moshe at the burning bush. Moshe, it's time for you to go and lead the Jewish people out of Egypt. Go to Paro, do these miracles, and you're going to bring about the Paro is going to let the Jews go free and come to Mount Sinai and to serve me. Finally, Moshe agrees, goes to Paro, does the miracles that God had told him to do, and Paro's response is, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't believe in this God that you're talking about. And the only reason you're talking about leaving is because you have too much free time. I'm going to increase your burden. And the first Torah portion of this book ends with the following words. Vayashav Moshe el Hashem. Moshe returns to God. Vayomer Hashem. Vayomer Hashem. And Moshe says to God, Lama hariosa lama zeh. Why are you making things worse? You ask me to do a job. You tell me I'm going to succeed. And then not only do I not succeed, I end up making it worse than it was before. Why do you want me to make it worse? Vayomer Hashem el Moshe. And Hashem says to Moshe, this is the last line of that first Torah portion. Ata sireh. Now you're going to see Asher eseh leParo, what I'm going to do to Paro. Ki biyad chazaka yishalchem, with a strong arm, I'm going to send you out of Egypt. Ubiyad chazaka yigarshem mi'arso, and with that strong arm, I'm going to have you released from Egypt. Well, sounds like the cliffhanger, right? The first episode, the hero's got to be in big trouble. In the next episode, it's going to work out all right. All right, so it's a literary tool for increasing drama and suspense. Okay, fine. The Ramban says it's much more than that. This is the theme of the entire book. And this is the model of Jewish history over and over and over again. It gets worse, it gets worse, it gets worse, and then it gets better. And that pattern repeats itself over and over and over again. And that historical pattern is so important that the book of Shemos, the second book, the book of Exodus, and the Torah in general incorporates that into our daily lives in many, many ways. But one of the most central is that we follow the calendar of the moon, the lunar cycle, the lunar calendar. Every month, just after the new moon appears, we go outside and we say a prayer called Kiddush Levana, the sanctification of the new month, the new moon. And we say the following words, V'lalvana amar shetischadesh ateres tiferes lamuse beten she'nasidin lischadesh kamosa. And to the moon we say, just like you were renewed, the moon gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and it disappears. It looks like it's no longer there, but it gets renewed. It gets reborn, and it grows bigger and bigger and bigger. And just as that's the pattern of the moon, our history, the Jewish pattern of our lives, both nationally and individually, we follow the same pattern. So we have in our calendar the way we mark our time, this constant collective reminder every day, every holiday. What is today? Today's the 23rd day of the month of Adar. That means the moon is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. A week from today, next Thursday, is Rosh Chodesh. That's going to be the beginning of the new lunar cycle. And then the moon's going to start to get bigger, bigger, bigger. And this, that we follow the lunar calendar, is the first mitzvah that is given to the Jewish people while we're still in Egypt. HaChodesh hazeh lochem rosh chodashim. You're going to follow the lunar calendar. This is a mitzvah that tells us that we arrange our lives, we arrange our time in accordance following the lunar calendar, the cycles of the moon. Because those cycles are our cycles. They are the cycles of our history. They are the cycles of our lives. And it is this portion that begins with this mitzvah that we will read this Shabbos. This Shabbos that we will read the fourth of 4 special Torah portions. And we begin with these words, HaChodesh hazeh lochem rosh chodashim. We read this portion every year on the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of the month of Nisan, is next Thursday. This Shabbos is the Shabbos before. We read this special portion, because this initiates for us the season of Pesach, the liberation from Egypt, the creation of our national identity, going from persecution and slavery to redemption and freedom and liberation. That is exactly what the moon represents. And it mirrors the story of Exodus. It gets worse before it gets better. Bob Dylan said it. They say the darkest hour is right before the dawn. But why does it have to be like that? Why is our history like that? Why are our lives like that? Why did we have to go through the persecution of Egypt in order to be able to be created as a Jewish people? Why did we have to go through the expulsion from Spain, etc., 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 all throughout our history? There's several answers to this question. I want to share one with you. I know I'm going a little bit over time tonight. I ask your indulgence. But I want to share with you a little bit of the life of Rabbi Yitzchak Luria. Rabbi Yitzchak Luria is from a family that originally was from Spain, and they were expelled in 1492. Rabbi Yitzchak Luria lived in Tzfat, in the northern part of Israel. He is known to us as the Arizal. He died at the age of 38. He is the most important teacher of Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, in the last 2,000 years. The Arizal grappled with the greatest issue of his day, the expulsion from Spain. Understand that for that generation that lived in its aftermath, the expulsion from Spain was as catastrophic and as disorienting as the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, the destruction of the temple, was centuries earlier. Why did it happen? How did it happen? So there's a traditional answer, a traditional response that's put forth by many people. We express it in our prayers. Because of our sins, we were exiled from our land. Spanish Jewry at that time was more acculturated than other Jewish communities. That was the traditional answer to why this happened. Now, that's a very problematic answer. We've discussed the problems and the complexity of that kind of an answer. We've discussed that before. The Arizal had a very different approach. The Arizal begins his answer by asking a daring question on a completely, seemingly unrelated topic. He asks, Bereshis bara Elokim, in the beginning God created heaven and earth. How could God create heaven and earth if God is everywhere? We say about God, Molo kol haaretz kavodo. The entire universe is filled with his glory. If the entire universe is filled for his glory, where's there room for us? Where's there room for a world? There's no space. There's no room for anything else. There's only God. Says the Arizal, based on earlier sources, but he emphasizes and elaborates on this. The first thing God did in order to create the universe, the world, is to exercise midas hatzimtzum. God had to contract himself. God had to exile himself, pull back in order to make space in which to create the world. The first act of creation is retraction, pulling back, making oneself smaller to make room for the creation. Listen to this. Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim ves haaretz. Well, we normally translate that is, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. V'haaretz haisa sahu vavahu. But the earth, as soon as it was created, was filled with chaos and emptiness. Listen to how the Arizal explains it. Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim ves haaretz. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. What's the first step that God took in order to create heaven and earth? V'haaretz haisa sahu vavahu. First, God created emptiness. God pulled back. God retracted. And so what was there was emptiness and chaos. Into that emptiness and chaos, that's the space in which God created heaven and earth. The first step is pulling back. And now, because that is an aspect of God's nature, so to speak, to put it in human words, and our highest goal in life is to imitate God, that principle is established by God as the pattern of Jewish history, as well as the paradigm in other areas of life as well, so that we don't miss it. God built that pattern of retraction, retreat, and then building. God incorporated that into our daily lives, starting with HaChodesh Hazeh Lochem Rosh Chodashim. Follow the lunar cycle. And that means that disappearance, retreat, is the precursor to growth, to brightness. Now, this does not mean that exile is not bitter. It does not mean that darkness is worth it because it leads to light. This is not about reward and punishment. The Arizal says that's just not what's going on here. What's going on here with this expulsion from Spain, it's about how crisis and chaos contain the seeds of peace and reconciliation and creativity. The persecution and slavery in Egypt led to the revelation at Sinai, led to the building of the Mishkan, led to the land of Israel. The expulsion from Spain led to the flourishing of Jewish life in Israel and in Eastern Europe. And every other example throughout our history, over and over and over again, nationally and as individuals. The story of Exodus, Zecher Liyetzias Mitzrayim, to remember going out of Egypt, is such a major part of the Torah and so many of the commandments and so much of our lives as Jews, because this is the pattern that God sets for us. And this gives us a way to view the world, a way to view history, and a way to view the events in our own lives. The significance of this lunar calendar that we read about is the way that leads us to redemption, and it leads us to how we view and experience our lives. My friends, I want to wish you a great evening and a beautiful Shabbos. And I look forward to seeing you soon in person.